Welcome to the Balancing Act podcast. I'm Andy Temte. Today we've got Jared Lindzon, a future of work thought leader and freelance journalist for publications like Fast Company and Toronto's Globe and Mail, along with a lot of other major publications. And Jared's joining us today. Welcome to the show, Jared.
Thanks so much, Andy.
Yeah, so for our listeners, Jared and I know each other really quite well because he was really intimately involved in the Balancing Act project, and we're working together again on our next book, which title is yet to be determined, but we're knee deep in that project. So thank you, Jared, for all your hard work on that.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for making my job easy.
Yeah. Working with me, I'm sure is.
It's been a pleasure.
Not the cakewalk that everybody thinks it is. So today we're going to continue our series on that lightning rod question. Nobody wants to work anymore, and we're going to tap into Jared's experience as both a journalist and a public speaker on the future of work to explore the nuance that lies behind this potentially polarizing black and white assessment of today's job market or the market for talent. But as usual, before we get started, Jared, tell our listeners your story.
Oh boy. I'm assuming you mean professionally speaking, and mostly of how I ended up where I am today, because I have a lot of stories to tell, but I'll try and keep it concise.
Sure.
I got into freelancing the way most people get into self-employment, which is a negative employment experience, specifically a bad boss that encouraged me to not want to work for someone else ever again. But I've been interested in journalism basically since high school. I got really into media studies as a broad category, and I pursued that in university, and then started volunteering for the school newspaper and just fell in love with the world of journalism. It was really interesting for me to see the things that I was doing at this little back room in the campus community center, windowless office with 20 other people crammed in. And the things that we were scribbling down was actually having a real world impact on the campus and on that little, contained environment that we were in. And I wanted to keep doing that with my life, to find different ways that I could affect positive change, just by communicating what was happening around me. So afterwards, I pursued a master's degree in journalism. I took the first job I could find, which, as alluded to earlier, was not a great experience. It wasn't really the traditional journalism work that I was hoping to do. It was more on the branded, sponsored side of things. And when I was looking to make that transition, I was meeting with editors and other freelancers. And specifically, I met with one editor from the Globe and Mail, which you mentioned earlier as well. And I told them, I was 23 at the time. I said I wanted to work remotely. I wanted to be a freelancer, and I'm a millennial. And he said, those are all the buzzwords that our careers department is trying to figure out right now. Why don't you try, some work for them? And it was such a natural fit. I'd never considered writing about work. I never, had an interest in human resources and management before. But as I got into that world, it just sort of felt natural, because it felt like the direction that the world was moving just made a lot of sense to me. And growing up watching every cartoon had that cliche of the dad who hated their job, whether it was The Simpsons or the Jetsons or whatever it was. The dad character just hated their boss and hated their job. And I thought, that's not the world that I want to exist in the future. And how do people accept this? And it turns out that a lot of people weren't accepting it at the time and were looking for change. And it was really interesting to be on the forefront of writing about those changes as they were happening. And of course, in the last 2 years, it's gone from a very niche topic to being something that is front of mind for just about everyone, which has also been an extremely interesting transition. And as you alluded to along the way, I've been working closely with the Globe and Mail and Fast Company, but as a freelancer, I've pursued opportunities with publications across the journalistic spectrum, from the New York Times to Rolling Stone to The Guardian. So my career has taken me to a lot of interesting places. some of which, related to this idea of the future of work and the way in which the world of work is changing, and some of which completely unrelated to that, but still interesting and fun. And part of why I love my job is the variety that it offers.
That's wonderful. A little bit off script, but who's the coolest person you've met? Because you've been out, you've been moving, you've been shaking as a freelance journalist. What's like the wow, that was a really awesome individual? Can you clue us in on any of those?
So I have quite a few, but I'm going to tailor the answer to the question asker. Although I don't know, I think we've discussed this before, and you weren't a big Grateful Dead fan, but I know you're a big fan of music from that era. But I had a very interesting conversation with Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead, and it was in person, and the whole time he was just noodling on his acoustic guitar while we were having a chat about literally life and death, talking about, music, and talking about just such a broad, we talked about business. We had a great, like, half-hour long intimate conversation, just me and him in the green room before a performance at a charity event. And the whole time he's just giving me this private concert, not even thinking. His fingers are just moving while he's talking. And that was a pretty incredible experience.
Oh wow! So our Dead fans out there, our Deadheads will really connect with that. So awesome. So let's dive right in. You've already told us about your route to freelance. I might want to hear a little bit more about the bad boss that drove you to freelance at some point. But let's dive right into the topic at hand. When you hear someone casually toss out the phrase, "nobody wants to work anymore," what goes through your mind? Did everyone just get lazy over the pandemic and abandon their work ethic, as the phrase implies?
No, to start there. A lot of things go through my head when I hear that statement. So many of them, feel very wrong, but understandable assumptions. So the first thing I would say is that I've been hearing that for a very long time as a millennial in particular, because from the very beginning, and I mean before I entered the workforce, I was being told by, everything I was reading, by adults in my life, that my generation just didn't have any work ethic, that we were entitled, that everything was supposed to be handed to us on a silver platter, that we expected to come in as an intern and 6 weeks later be the CEO. We experienced that in a really significant way. That was sort of my first interaction with that statement. It wasn't nobody wants to work because of this pandemic. It was your generation doesn't have a work ethic. And I've been brushing up against that for a very long time. I've written articles about it, and I've looked into it. It turns out that every single generation, and it's like I can go back thousands of years. Plato and Aristotle complained that the younger generations had no work ethic.
Nice.
This goes back pretty much to the beginning of human history. Everyone reaches an age and believes that the folks who are coming up behind them are lazy and entitled, and are too passionate and not act with their heart and not with their brains, and don't have the sort of work ethic that they did at that age, forgetting that every generation has faced. You can read about Gen Xers being described in the same terms. You can certainly read about baby boomers during the hippie era, being talked about in the same way. So that, to me, the first thought I have is that that generational critique that comes up, and I'm sure in 20 years from now I'll be talking about the younger folks as they didn't have it as they didn't work as hard as I did at that age, because it's almost like our natural instinct. The other big thing, though, that I think is a bit more specific to this moment in this post-pandemic period, is the fact that people, when people make that statement, they're failing to acknowledge that work as an institution, as a huge part of our everyday lives, wasn't a natural fit for a pretty large proportion of the workforce, for a variety of reasons, a wide variety of reasons. But the structures that we had always assumed to be just the way things are and had to be were not a natural fit for most people. And so when everyone got an opportunity to experience a different structure and different norms and a different way of doing things, leaning into that was seen as a push away from work as we knew it. And pushing away from work as we knew it was perceived as nobody wants to work. It's not that nobody wants to work. It's that not everyone wants to work the way that we have defined work for, our entire lives up to this point.
Yeah. I think that's a great segue because, in episode 38, a couple of episodes ago, Dan Strafford and I talked about, we did the setup for Nobody Wants to Work Anymore. And I certainly didn't pull any punches regarding my position that the phrase is unhelpful at best and a derogatory slur at worst to describe a very complicated set of issues. We talked about the Great Resignation in that episode, and it's linked to this phrase. From your perspective, what are some of the key drivers beyond what you've already described to the Great Resignation and these shifting attitudes about our relationship with work?
Yeah, there's so much to say there. I would say the first thing I would want to bring up is the fact that, as I mentioned, I've been working remotely. I believe this is going into my 9th or 10th year now. So this is the standard for me. This is the norm. But for the 8 years or 7.5 years that I was doing it before the pandemic, I was under the impression, and so was everyone else, that I was just a unique personality, that I was different from the average person, that I, for whatever reason, thrived in a remote environment in a way that the average person wouldn't, And in my head, I thought it was amazing. How could anybody choose to work in an office when you could work from home and not have to commute and not have to be in front of people? I was more productive. All the things that people have now known to be their experience. But for a long time, I was the outlier. But as soon as everyone else got a taste for what I had been experiencing for a long time and how great it was and all the benefits that are out there for a lot of people, not for everyone, but for a lot of people that were like me, and really enjoyed that opportunity to experience a different workplace structure, it just fit naturally in a way that the traditional workplace structure didn't. And now we're reaching a point where organizations are saying, sorry, that was a fun experiment, but we're going back to the way things were because we're used to operating that way. We know how to construct systems, and how to operate under that structure. So we're just going back to the familiar. A lot of people are saying, no, I know that there's a better way. I know from experience that this works better for me, for my personal life, for my professional life. So I'm not going back. And if you're not going to let me back, there's a lot of other competitors of yours that would welcome me, in a remote setting. So I think that is a huge driver. And I have to also give some credit here to Microsoft. Microsoft just put out a huge study. I look at tons of these studies as part of my work, but Microsoft's, in the last 2 years in particular, as they've dug into this future of work, changing workplace attitudes sort of topic, they said, bottom line, out of all this research is the people who left the office in 2020 are not the same as the people who are coming back today. In that they might have the same name, they might look the same, maybe a little bit grayer, but they are not the same people because of what they've been through that they were before. And I think the friction that we're describing is an assumption by employers that they are the same people, they can be treated the same way, they have the same needs and desires, and demands, and not really paying attention to the fact that we've all gone through this really, difficult emotional experience. Some would say bordering, traumatic. And we're not the same people that we are, and we have different needs. And so the companies that are ignoring that change are the ones who are seeing mass resignations. And also, it's important to note that, had we entered this period of offices reopening at a point where the economy and specifically the job market looked differently, we might not be seeing such a big effect. But the Great Resignation has got this snowball effect where, there are a lot of vacancies right now because of people not finding that alignment. And because there's so many vacancies, it's so easy to switch jobs to find something that aligns with the structure that you would prefer, whether that's in person, remote, or hybrid. So it kind of snowballs into this effect where, because the job market is so hot, the prospect of leaving isn't nearly as scary or as intimidating as it typically is. And that's also another huge driver. If we'd come out of this lockdown period back into the office, without that really strong employment market, employees would probably suck it up and just be happy to be employed. But right now, they don't have to settle for whatever they can get. With their current employer, they have a world of opportunities.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Call everybody back into the office and go back to the way things were at your own peril.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. So our last series of episodes that aired this spring focused on the reskilling revolution. 1 billion people globally need to be reskilled over the next 10 years. As a future of work thought leader, is the quote unquote nobody wants to work anymore theme related to the prediction that 1 billion people will need to be reskilled over the next 10 years?
Yes and no. I think the nobody wants to work anymore statement is, again, missing a lot of the nuance that's out there. And where I approach this, and you might even have a better perspective on this, is that I think a lot of this comes back to education, and the way in which education has been built in a very specific way and has existed in a very specific way for a very long time, that no longer suits the needs of the realities of the economy as it exists today. So, we used to operate in an environment where you got your base level education in elementary and high school, and then you sort of specialized in something in post secondary. And that 3 to 4 years of education was enough to carry you through the next 50 years of your life. And so that one credential was hugely important and was really a precursor, it was a prerequisite to a successful career in a specific field. That world is long gone. And it was before the pandemic, but it's especially acute now. And as roles are changing more rapidly because technology is changing more rapidly and forcing us to change with it, and the most innovative companies are ultimately going to succeed. And so if we need to keep up with the pace of innovation, waiting for a 3 or 4 year degree is no longer practical. And so I'm very interested in the topic of micro-credentialing. And I've actually spoken with post-secondary institutions that are really focused on this because they see it as the future of education. That there will be a place for the 3 or 4 year degree in the future. But just as there is, a place for in-office work and remote work, there is a place for the big degree that can give you a, very important foundation versus a micro credential, which might be better suited for different roles. I think what we're coming to realize in a lot of different domains, and education being one of them, is that this one size fits all approach that we've long assumed to be the best and only way is not. And so, going back to the statement, nobody wants to work anymore, I think that is sort of ignoring the fact that higher education has long been, by design, exclusionary and only includes a pretty narrow slice of the population. And there's a lot of people out there who would really want to work in, jobs that currently require a 4 year degree for no other reason than tradition and history. There's nothing about the job that really requires you to have a 4 year degree. We just, sort of want people who have proven that they can make it that way through, education, but the skills aren't directly transferable necessarily. But the fact that it's still a prerequisite, and the fact that post-secondary education isn't open to everybody, leads a lot of people to look around and say, nobody wants to work. But is it because they don't want to work, or they can't work because they can't get the credential that is a prerequisite for basically every job in the economy? So that's also where I think micro-credentialing can really help bridge that gap.
Yeah, we'll have a subsequent conversation on micro credentials and stackables and ripping apart the degree. And I do want to have that conversation in a future show to tap into your future of work experience. But right now, let's just hone in. Let's leverage your future of work experience to ask the question: what are in your opinion, the top 2 or 3 skills that you believe that talent across generations need to acquire and hone to be ready for the next step in our talent and labor markets?
So the number one is very obvious, because in studies and on job postings, it is consistently the first requirement that comes up, or the most frequently cited requirement for a majority of jobs on platforms like LinkedIn and elsewhere, where they actually share this data, and that's communication. And communication is a pretty broad term that encompasses a lot of different forms of communication. Written communication, asynchronous communication. There's a lot to the communication under the communication umbrella. But if you look at the trend line of how frequently communication is cited as a requirement for a job, it's a hockey stick. It's gone from being very specific to roles that had the word communication in it: corporate communications, external communications, media communications, and maybe sales. Those were the only jobs that really required strong communication skills 20 years ago. Now there isn't really a lot of jobs left that don't expect a certain base level of communication skills. And if you've been the kind of person that wants to sort of get your work done in a back room and not really have that face-to-face interaction, or isn't really comfortable with it, or just hasn't really put an emphasis on communication skills in the past, unfortunately, now's the time where you can't really get away from it. Almost every job now, if you think about accountants and people in professional services, even doctors, folks that were in roles that were considered to be very technical and not really emphasize the communication skills, are making a huge shift right now. And one last point I'll say on this is that there are studies that show that medical errors are often, I think 70% of medical errors can be traced back to a failure of communication.
Yep.
And so the medical industry in the medical education world has taken that very seriously, and now they're vetting candidates as part of the med school application process to ensure that they have a base level of communication skills. So there really isn't an industry, a role, a generation that isn't touched by this growing emphasis on communication. That would be number one.
Yeah, so let's pause on number one, and we might not get to 2 and 3 because your number one is so incredibly important. And I had the next question teed up as advice for individuals rethinking their relationship with work, but I want to twist that just a little bit, and because you're closer to the generation that grew up with emoticons and communication primarily over text messaging and other messaging services. So we have this extreme need for heightened communication skills, yet individuals who are entering the workforce today for the first time grew up communicating in a very different way than the written word, and frankly even the spoken word. What advice do you have for the 20-year-old who's entering the workforce and has and probably has a worldview that, well, I can just communicate with everybody via emoticons because, well, my generation all gets it, and I don't care what the 58-year-old Andy Tempties of the world think about it. What's your advice there?
Well, that goes back to what I was saying at the very top with this generational divide. The older generations will always have a problem with the standard operating procedures of the next generation in line. That's just that's a feature of being human. I think it goes far back into our human history, but I have seen that concern play out before. I've seen a lot of Gen Z, folks being concerned that they don't have the communication skills necessary. I think what's going to end up happening, before I get to the advice very quickly, what ends up happening in a lot of these circumstances is that both sides kind of meet halfway. And that's happened throughout history where you have sort of this existing layer of management and of certain practices that have been that way for a long time, rubbing up against a generation that's demanding a different way of doing things. The end result usually ends up somewhere in between, where the Andy Tempties of the world might use a little bit more emojis, but the 20-year-old intern is also going to be expected to be able to craft a very strong and well communicated letter or email to a client when they need to. So we're probably going to end up finding our way somewhere in between. And I'm already seeing it in Slack channels. There's a lot more GIFs and emojis, and people are getting more comfortable in their internal communications, but externally, it's still very professional. So I would say don't stress too much if you're a 20-something, because the world is going to meet you halfway in this. But at the same time, it's important that you do have at least a base level of professional communication skills out there. And a lot of it ends up coming through experience. So, I would say it's important to work on those skills. Communication is not going to be any less important throughout the course of your career, but it will get easier as you get used to it over time. And eventually, this current generation is going to meet you halfway, but you also have to meet them halfway and be prepared to provide that sort of professional level of communication when it is necessary.
Yeah, cool. So in 30 seconds, what were skills 2 and 3?
I was going to say a base level of comfort with technology.
Yep.
You need that. There's no way around that. There's really, I don't even know if I need to get into any detail about that. And the last one, which I'm sure you've had plenty of conversations about, is empathy, which we could talk for hours about that. But I think if I just put the word out there, a lot of people will understand why I'm saying it.
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to finish with a fairly difficult question. Let's make the assumption that you could have an open-minded discussion with a manager or leader who has adopted this frame, this mental set of nobody wants to work anymore. What advice would you give to help that individual see the nuance in our current market for talent?
Yeah. I think it would start with pointing out the ways in which the lived experience of the current generation differs from their own, because I think that is a degree of understanding that gets sort of passed up, and it does go back to, or passed over, and it goes back to that word empathy. If you aren't putting yourselves in the shoes of the folks that you're criticizing, the criticism isn't very valid. You need to try at least to see their perspective, what they've been through, what they've grown up with, the world in which they're operating in, and how it differs from your lived experience. And there's a lot of implications there as well for folks that have existed in a world where they are in the majority population versus those who are from more, underrepresented communities, and how their experiences might differ. So I think that's an important note. I would also say that the more that they, stand firm in this perspective that nobody wants to work anymore, the harder it's going to be for them to attract and retain the talent that they will need in order to succeed. They are only making the situation worse for themselves. Not everyone has to have it really, really hard to be valid in their struggles. We've all been through a really tough time the last few years. It's important to acknowledge that you don't really know what people have gone through and are going through. And a little bit of empathy would go a long way. The last thing I'll say is that, this generation and the workforce in general, especially after the last 2 years, is starting to embrace a different perspective on mental health and on things like therapy and even yoga. And, there's some interesting research out there on hallucinogenics as well. Maybe a trip to the other side of the world. I think anything that can help expand your capacity for empathy to sort of dig into where that assumption that nobody wants to work anymore is coming from, and trying to understand what the experiences are of other people. It's not an easy task. It doesn't come about naturally. And the reason why we hear this phrase so commonly is because it is a lot of work, and not everyone is willing to do that kind of work. It's a lot easier to just, say nobody wants to work and not bother to see it from their perspective. So I would say, I would really encourage them to do the work, to understand where people are coming from. I wouldn't expect that they would, because it is a lot of work, but I would hope that they'd consider it.
Yeah. Well, Jared, we're at time. I'm sure our listeners are going to get a lot from this conversation. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank our listeners for being here. This is the Balancing Act podcast. I'm Andy Temte. You can find everything at andrewtemte.com or on my LinkedIn profile. Please like, subscribe. Please rate the podcast. That helps out a great deal. But again, thank you for your time, and thank you, Jared, for being here.
Thanks for having me, Andy.